Thank you for that. Appreciate it. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for that introduction. I'm so happy to be here tonight to speak at Villanova. I went to undergrad right up the road at Lehigh University, so it's always cool to come back to Pennsylvania and be able to speak with both students, faculty, and staff. I would in particular like to thank the Department of Sociology and Criminology for the invitation to deliver this talk this evening, and special shout out to Professor Glenn Bracey, who was instrumental in coordinating the dates, logistics, and details to make tonight happen. And also I want to thank faculty members Lorena Avila, Max Osborne, and Guillermo Escano for being so hospitable prior to this talk and sitting and chatting it up with me, so I really appreciate that. Today I'll speak about my book, Purgatory, Citizenship, as you heard, published by the University of California Press, which examines the ways in which individuals returning to society navigate and negotiate the reentry process after leaving jail and/or prison facilities. Broadly, reentry is simply the transition from spaces of confinement back to community. However, this change is far from being simple. Throughout tonight's talk, I'll speak on key aspects of the book, including what I mean by the concept of purgatory citizenship, transitional experiences of those returning to society utilizing halfway house facilities and community-based reentry centers, and the case of abolition within the context of reentry. Finally, I'll finish this evening's talk with this concept that I'm thinking about, or what as the subtitle of this talk is, Abolition Reentry, and how it builds from previous work and continues the work I do with system-impacted youth in New York City through principles of restorative justice. So as a trained sociologist, much of my work looks at the intersection of race, inequality, and justice. More specifically, I've investigated and interrogated the rise of what is known as mass incarceration and the role of reentry in people's lives. Tonight, I'll elaborate on the interconnectedness between capitalism and incarceration, more specifically reentry systems, via the concepts of the prison industrial complex, as well as what has been referred to as the prisoner reentry industry. In sum, I argue that reentry is not the termination of what is known as the carceral continuum, which often refers to the, again, interconnected webs of various systems that rely on punishment, as reentry guidelines, systems, and institutions are invested in perpetual retributions, which leaves justice-impacted individuals in this sort of limbo status, or again, what I refer to as a purgatory citizenship. This status highlights how people regain some rights, but continue to be denied others, leaving them simultaneously in the middle and at the margins. Further, the need for reentry highlights the extreme social stratification and disparities that the culture of punishment creates by removing people from communities, placing them in environments of harm, and eliminating forms of social and cultural capital. Therefore, abolition reentry is focused on putting reentry out of business. This book is a qualitative study of the lived experiences of the reentry process. For over 3 years, I volunteered at a community-based reentry organization in which individuals exiting various stages of the criminal legal system came to the office for a variety of reasons, including job training and workforce development, familial and parenting classes, workshops and group practices, as well as individual case management and a variety of other reasons. Some simply to have a place to be still, even if for a moment to collect themselves. During this time, I conducted life history interviews with clients, facilitated focus groups, and did ethnographic observations of both the clients, the staff, and also just the overall ecosystem of the reentry space, as well as the surrounding community of Newark, New Jersey. Ultimately, this led to my two main research questions. The first, how do individuals navigate and negotiate reentry with diminished legal rights and amplified social stigmas? As I got to know folks, their backgrounds, and the daunting tasks of returning to society, I learned the various ways that individuals attempted to figure out systems. Often, popular opinion and popular media might think or believe that leaving prison is the final component of a criminal infraction, as this sort of linear process where an individual begins by, breaking the law, is then arrested, convicted, serves their time, and released to start anew. Yet, as I argue, reentry is not the termination, but rather the extension of criminal penalty that continues this perpetual harm, violence, and numerous sanctions on a person's life. In sum, reentry is not a linear path, but rather an imprecise, fragile, and complex web of obstacles. Because of what I was seeing folks experience, my ethnography generated a second question. What does it mean to do reentry? Like many social constructs, and borrowing from West and Zimmerman's concept of quote-unquote doing gender, I argue reentry has a performative component in which individuals must engage in tasks, rituals, and ceremonies to be seen as acceptable by a broader audience, or as the notion of purgatory implies, atone for their sins in this kind of indefinite manner. Therefore, reentry as a system is not about rehabilitation or completion of punishment, but rather checking off boxes, meeting metrics, and complying to rules regardless of if they serve you or your community, to measure some sort of predisposed notion of what we call quote-unquote success, defined by the state, grant offices, donors, and others who are in this kind of reentry system. Well, tonight I'll touch on some aspects of the book. I just want to give a brief outline of the book and its themes. Each chapter is organized around these themes, and I'm more than happy to speak about anything during the Q&A if you're like, you said something cool, but you didn't talk about it. Or not cool, and you didn't like it. I don't know. So chapter 1 utilizes Guyanese activist and historian Walter Rodney's concept of underdevelopment to explore relationships of exploitation. In this case, how incarceration and reentry exploit local communities. Chapter 2 articulates this concept of purgatory citizenship, in which individuals experience that limbo identity of not being fully incapacitated, but not fully emancipated and having to navigate their freedom. Chapter 3 focuses on the halfway system in New Jersey, which many individuals I worked with were utilizing as part of the reentry transition. But ultimately, they critique this system as exacerbating harms that would put them back into prison. Chapter 4 highlights how even though an individual exits incarcerated settings, not everything stays behind, but rather aspects of incarceration can be inscribed on the body in both physical and emotional, visible and invisible, as well as abstract and tangible ways. Chapter 5 focuses on the Reentry Center and the various intended and unintended consequences of this space for the clients that utilized it. And finally, Chapter 6 focuses on the concept of abolition from the perspectives of those doing reentry. To understand this work, I think it's really important to contextualize the environment and the history that led to the field site of where I did my research. Today, New Jersey is a leading state in criminal justice reform. In fact, only about 30% of all New Jersey residents released or reincarcerated within 3 years. This is significantly lower than the national average of about 67%, or 2/3 of the population who have been incarcerated. In the 21st century alone, Republican and Democrat governors alike have urged for reform within the Garden State. For example, Governor Corzine abolished the death penalty in 2007. Governor Christie advocated for drug treatment in the wake of the opiate epidemic. And the current governor, Phil Murphy, has signed legislation that allowed formerly incarcerated individuals still under criminal supervision, such as parole and probation, the ability to vote. Prior to this, and while I did this research, New Jersey residents were barred from voting while under all forms of the criminal supervision. Finally, in the last decade, the state has reduced its overall prison population almost in half, which is due to multiple factors that include largely transforming pretrial bail, changes in parole, and releasing individuals during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. Yet despite these strides, New Jersey still has major issues. First, it has the largest racial disparity of incarceration of any state in the country. While Black New Jerseyans make up only 14% of the state population, Black residents consistently make up over 60% of all the state prison population. According to the ACLU, New Jersey has a 12-to-1 Black to white racial disparity in its prisons, meaning for every one white person in prison, there's 12 Black people. Further, Essex County, where Newark is located, consistently has the largest population of confinement, with roughly 15% of the state prison population coming from that county. Finally, research on incarceration highlights that race, class, gender, and geographic location play a significant role of who ends up in prison. Therefore, we should be able to fully understand that being poor, Black, urban, inhabitant of Newark significantly increases the likelihood of being incarcerated as opposed to being white, affluent, or suburban resident. Therefore, the question begs, how did this happen? Newark, New Jersey is often in the news when things go bad. It has been used as a criminal backdrop in American television, such as The Sopranos, and was voted the most dangerous city in America in the mid-1990s. This image of the city did not happen by chance, but rather because of a host of social forces and institutional level harm. Like many industrial cities, Newark was a thriving and flourishing metropolitan area that was home to textile industries and became the residence of for many Irish, Italian, and Jewish immigrants from Europe in the 19th and early 20th century. In the aftermath of the American Civil War, Newark, like many northern cities, became a quote-unquote promised land for many Black Southerners fleeing the Ku Klux Klan and Jim Crow segregation. In fact, my own grandparents, both from Georgia, met in Newark after leaving the South during the period known as the Great Migration. And like many northern cities, newly arrived Black migrants were tolerated but not integrated, rather being relegated to Black enclaves or more commonly referred to as ghettos. For Newark, a pivotal moment in the city's racially divided history occurred in July of 1967. One evening, a Black cab driver by the name of John Smith was pulled over, beaten, and dragged into a local police precinct by white police officers. A crowd that saw this happen initially believed that Smith had been killed. As news spread, people took to the streets and and began 5 days of rebellion, becoming known as the Newark riots. Yet the Newark rebellion did not occur in a vacuum. In fact, less than a week later, an uprising in Detroit, Michigan was sparked by similar harassment of Black residents by white cops. Both Newark and Detroit rebellions saw the highest loss of life and most significant property damage in that era. But they weren't the only rebellions. Other rebellions in Watts, Baltimore, Harlem also occurred. By the end of the summer of 1967, President Lyndon Johnson put together what was known as the Kerner Commission, a scathing report released in 1968 highlighting the various missteps of local, state, and federal agencies on why these rebellions broke out. One of the most cited lines of the report reads, "Our nation is moving towards two societies, one Black, one white, separate and unequal." The report goes on to recommend massive investments in the areas of education and housing. Beyond this, New Jersey commissioned its own report known as the Lilly Commission, which also highlighted factors that led to the rebellion that had to do with institutional racism, government neglect, and police harassment. To this day, most of both reports' recommendations have not been implemented. While these uprisings should have been a wake-up call to invest in communities, these rebellions were used as a catalyst to usher in a new wave of ideology towards dealing with social problems, known as the punitive turn. Instead of investing in housing, healthcare, and employment, amongst other social programs, governments capitalized on white fear of Black rebellions, as the civil rights and Black power movements, as well as other social and cultural movements like the anti-war movement and the hippie countercultures, were questioning the so-called American way. The state responded with reactionary and retributive policies. Therefore, instead of recognizing the devastation of structural racism and institutional discrimination that brought about these rebellions, government flipped it and made this about, quote unquote, personal responsibility, shifting the burden of poverty and the lack of resources onto those most affected, the poor and minoritized communities. Ultimately, governments invested heavily in law enforcement and corrections, coupled with the already existing white flight, where white urban inhabitants were flocking to suburban areas in a post-war era that many blacks were prohibited from entering, as well as deindustrialization as companies either moved overseas or opted for automation. Inner cities saw urban decay and neglect spread. The broader social welfare system of public housing and assistance that afforded many European immigrants the ability to fulfill their American dream was dashed away for Black Americans. Instead, subpar, neglected public housing, deteriorating transit systems, influx of police, corrections, and criminal sanctions, as well as the sensationalized and propagandized war on drugs became the reality for many urban, poor, Black folks across America, specifically in Newark. This steady rise of incarceration throughout the latter half of the 20th century and into the early 20th century peaked in 2008, 2009, when over 2.4 million American residents were incarcerated. However, in 2010, the Bureau of Justice Statistics stated that for the first time, more individuals exited prison than entered them since they began collecting this data in 1977, making reentry one of the most significant and important social events facing the American public. In short, the United States had spent 4+ decades locking up millions of people with no national plan or strategy and how to make this transition out of carceral settings feasible. This is the world the men and women I worked with were born into and now attempting to navigate. The picture on the screen here is of a storefront window on the presidential election day in November 2012. It is a t-shirt of Barack Obama that was prominently displayed in downtown Newark at the intersection of Broad and Market Streets. On that day, downtown Newark was in full jubilation as volunteers energized passersby, making sure they got out and vote. The local music man was playing Obama speeches, and many stores and street vendors were selling Obama buttons, hats, and as you can see, t-shirts. Running against Mitt Romney, Obama as the incumbent overwhelmingly won Essex County, New Jersey, with over 78% of the vote. As the first and only Black president, Newark residents saw Obama as my president. I was also caught up in the celebration and excited to exercise my right to vote. But as I walked from the train station in downtown Newark to the Reentry Center, a sobering realization came over me, which was that all the individuals that I would interact with at the center on that day were not allowed to vote. As I mentioned, at the time, New Jersey prohibited anyone incarcerated on parole or on probation from voting. And voting, amongst other restrictions, led to what I call this concept of purgatory citizenship, which is this idea that individuals, again, are in this limbo status, not completely confined, they have limited freedoms, but this can also impact their livelihood. And so let me share a few of their stories. Stuart was a clean-shaven, 52-year-old Black man with brown skin and an athletic build. He recalled election night of Obama's first election, saying, quote, "I was in the SHU, the segregated housing unit, and the guard," and I'm gonna curse here, so please don't take it against me, "this fat white piece of shit knew I was following the election closely. And sometime in the late evening, while making his rounds, he whispered into my cell, 'The nigger won.' He said it in a way to try to get me angry, but I remember crying out of joy and then regret, because millions of Black people were out on the streets celebrating this moment. I felt ashamed because I thought about my parents and my grandparents who sacrificed so much, who never got the opportunity to vote. And I didn't just let them down, or excuse me, I didn't just let myself down, I let generations of Black people down." The best summation that I heard during my field work of this limbo status and highlighting purgatory citizenship was offered by Sharif, a Black male in his early 50s, who stated, quote, It's like dangling a carrot in front of a rabbit. That's how I feel, he explained. We can see freedom and maybe even taste it, but they are never going to give it to us. It's like having one foot in and one foot out, and we must straddle that line, because in an instance, it can all be taken away, just like that. No matter how well we do, when you come home, you must be perfect. Building on this idea around social mobility and being stuck, Jamal was a 26-year-old whose story exemplified that precarity of being stuck and that inability to secure housing after release. He had lived in a halfway house for less than 6 months when his aunt agreed to let him move in with her and her 2 sons. After a month, Jamal was still struggling to find a job, and his parole officer, a black male of West Indian descent, was dissatisfied with his effort, which put Jamal's housing into question. After a random inspection of her home, the parole officer gave his aunt a list of needed modifications. For instance, his aunt's cell phone was considered insufficient to keep tabs on Jamal, and she had to add a landline phone with a cord that did not have call forwarding, three-way calling, caller ID, or the ability to put a person on hold. While this type of phone was not expensive, it took some effort to find a phone without any of these amenities. The cost, however, involved installation fees and the monthly telephone bills, which were now charged to his aunt. As this is an example that indicates the financial cost of reentry that can be burdensome, not just for those going through this process, but also for those around them. By the end of the 2nd month, Jamal explained that he and his aunt's relationship was being strained because of parole. At the end of the 3rd month, Jamal's parole officer was no longer allowing him to stay at his aunt's home. When I asked him why, he responded, quote, "Because of the dogs." Jamal's aunt had 2 pit bull terriers. Up until this point, Jamal had barely mentioned the dogs. But when he had met with his parole officer the previous week, he was told that he was in violation of his parole if the dogs remained in the home, as this breed of dog is often criminalized and seen as not suitable for people's living conditions when they come out of prison. Jamal eventually began staying with his grandmother at a senior living building. He had become friendly with the overnight female security guard, who allowed him to come. He was flirting with her. And, if I need to explain that, but he was putting his motion in, right? All right, we got to get you to laugh a little bit, right? It's a lot of heavy stuff, so we got to find the joy in it where we can. And she allowed him to come during her shift as long as he left before she went off duty. The experiences of Jamal, who was unofficially living with his grandmother, highlighted one of the ways people going through reentry had to constantly navigate and negotiate this process. Jamal attempted to navigate his parole by finding stable housing, making modification to his aunt's home, and trying to fulfill stipulations such as gainful employment. However, his parole officer made this process essentially impossible. Therefore, Jamal began negotiating his freedom, and he eventually ended up back in prison. Finally is the story of Gwen, which highlights the attempts to heal in their reentry. "I was pregnant when I was arrested," she explained. Gwen described how hard it was to be incarcerated while pregnant, but was fortunate that there were older black women who had smuggled in special food and vitamins to keep her unborn baby healthy. When she went into labor, she was not allowed to have an epidural and shackled to the hospital bed, as is the case across the country, despite medical risks to both the mother and child. Social workers pressured and influenced Gwen to give up her baby for adoption, as she was facing a 20-year prison sentence. Although adopted, Gwen received letters and pictures depicting various milestones in her son's life from his adoptive parents. But she admitted that she was not the best at keeping up communication, and their correspondence ended. Upon her release, however, with the help of social media, she found her son and learned that he was a father to a baby girl. After completing parole in 2011, she traveled out of state and met her son for the first time since his birth in 1991. I had never been more scared in my life, she said. I think he was too. When he opened the door, I just lost my breath. I hugged him and squeezed him tight and just kept whispering, I'm sorry. He kept saying, I know, Ma, I know. He has a girlfriend and a job, and my granddaughter looks just like me when I was a baby. So for Gwen, healing from incarceration and reentry became her priority. Let me talk a little bit about what I mean by halfway. This is a picture of Delaney Hall in Newark. It's now owned by the GEO Group, one of the largest for-profit prison systems in the world. Prior to that, Delaney Hall was a 1,200-bed halfway house operated by the now defunct Community Education Centers, headquartered in New Jersey, but operated in 17 states as well as various Caribbean islands. The history of halfway houses, like prisons, came out of a progressive urge to help vulnerable populations. And the earliest halfway houses in the United States were founded by the Women's Prison Association and the Volunteers of America in the 19th century, which were used to rehabilitate through education, housing, and healthcare. In the latter half of the 20th century, as the criminal legal system took that punitive turn, so did many halfway facilities, in which rehabilitation became a tertiary premise. In fact, large conglomerates like CEC were not really invested in rehabilitation at all, but rather profit. This sentiment was highlighted when CEC came under fire in the 2010s because of this seemingly conflict of interest that they ran both private halfway houses as well as the assessment center in New Jersey, in which New Jersey residents who were in prison, who were going up for release, were sent and evaluated before being sent to a halfway house. In other words, CEC would receive a per diem for their evaluation and then receive another per diem for the residents in their facilities, essentially getting paid twice for the same person. Politicians and lawmakers have traditionally been okay with this system, as it allows the state to incarcerate individuals at lower financial rates than state institutions. Some reports have highlighted that CEC was spending less than half as much per day on individuals. Overall, reentry became about saving the state money and not providing services. And so we have to talk about this term, the prison industrial complex, which was coined in the late 1990s to describe systems that built prisons not for their need, but for a demand by various stakeholders to earn profit. While there is contention if an actual prison industrial complex exists, I, along with others, argue that the concept of a prison industrial complex goes beyond simply the dollars and cents of it, but rather creating a culture of retribution and punitive measures that is seen in America as we are accustomed to individuals being given extraordinary long sentences that are often unheard of in other developed nations. Therefore, the prison industrial complex is not solely about economics, but rather creating a social ecosystem of punishment. Further, building off of the prison industrial complex is this concept of the prisoner reentry industry, which was coined by criminologist Doug Tompkins, who argues similarly that organizations, institutions, and various stakeholders are invested in profiting off of individuals being released from penal institutions through various programs and activities that formerly incarcerated individuals are either mandated or strongly encouraged to take part in. So in sum, the prison industrial complex is invested in bringing people into carceral settings, whereas the prisoner reentry industry is invested in not letting people out of those carceral apparatuses. Many of the people I worked with became frustrated and irritated with the halfway house system as they were promised rehabilitation and services, but were experiencing just as much violence and little to no assistance. Alex had said emphatically, quote, "If I knew what I know now, I would rather max out," alluding to the idea that he would rather have stayed in state prison than go to a halfway facility. Alex, one of the few white males in my study, and the only former outlaw motorcycle gang member, big dude, tatted up, big teddy bear. He described his drug and alcohol addictions being the main reason he continued to cycle in and out of the system. Yet none of his criminal offenses were related to actually drugs and alcohol, but as he made it clear, these substances are the main reason. Therefore, he had high hopes of attending NA and AA meetings in the halfway house, but found out that he was not allowed to attend because of the long wait list and the priority given to those who had charges related to drugs and alcohol. Therefore, Alex had to seek out alternative NA and AA meetings and community to support his sobriety. Further, he found that the halfway house to be triggering as there was rampant drug use within these facilities. And so we think about this concept of quote unquote doing reentry, as I stated earlier, highlights these various rituals and activities and ceremonies individuals exiting prison must perform and to receive certificates and other merits to show that they are quote unquote rehabilitated. And this concept is summed up best by a man by the name of Freddie, who was a black male who served over 20 years, when he commented, quote, "I'm all grouped out," which was this notion that throughout his prison, halfway house, and community and organization experiences, many of the same programs and group-style activities were given. Freddie's critique was not that there should be no programming, but that there needs to be diversified programming and have a more concerned effort into incorporate programs that would build tangible and practical life skills. Therefore, yes, a program on time management is important, but how many time management do you need before you actually get the opportunity to put it into practice? So many believe the halfway system was not designed to help them, but rather keep them in this perpetual cycle of reentry. Bobby was a black male in his mid-40s who had served 15 years in prison. During his time in prison, he developed a drug habit, which was only exacerbated while in the halfway house, with little to no intervention by the halfway system. The only intervention was the so-called random urine test, in which he was forced to take what would, as you would maybe think, indicate dirty. He would be sent back to the assessment center. After Bobby's third failed urine, he was eventually sent back to state prison. Freddie, who was a good friend of Bobby, summed up this vicious cycle of reentry, stating, quote, "The halfway got all they could out of him. He went back and forth 3 times. That's 3 different payments on him. Each time the clock starts over. They not just going to send us back. They squeezed him dry and got all the money they could out of him. And watch, next year, they're going to send him right back to the halfway house. It's all a scam. The prison system is the biggest hustlers out here. We are small time compared to them." And so let me tell you a little bit about the reentry space. For many to begin the process of reentry, they are often told over and over they must secure employment and housing. However, there are often more immediate needs, such as the need for appropriate clothing, both for season and occupation, literacy and digital skills, such as the use of a smartphone, email, and other technologies. Right? Imagine you went into prison in the 90s and now someone says, pull out your phone and go on the app to apply for something, like, right? And lastly, the need for simply an ID, a state ID. For many, years incarcerated meant the loss of important documents such as birth certificates, social security cards, or driver's licenses. And to obtain these forms of identification and prove who you were, you needed both financial, became both a financial and time burden. Anybody ever been to the DMV? Right? Interestingly, I found the concept of labor to be problematized at the reentry center. Most individuals entered this space with the same reason or rationale. Quote, "I need a job." Many felt pressured to find employment immediately to satisfy a condition release, such as parole. However, I began to see that for some, the concept of labor or the need for a job was more complex and went back to that doing reentry because they were just knee-jerk reactions of, I need a job, and parroting what they had learned or what they believed they should say as part of this process of doing reentry. So for example, when we start to factor in things like age and gender, which played a pivotal role in the notions of finding work. Ray, who was a 62-year-old black man, said bluntly, quote, "I'm sick of lifting heavy boxes all day." Having complained about having bad knees, a sore back, and developing arthritis in his hands, Ray begrudgingly took a warehouse job to satisfy his parole requirement, but explained that he would rather spend time with his wife. In fact, he was looking beyond employment altogether. He spoke often and fondly of his two grandsons, both all-star football athletes. One was already playing Division I college football, and the other was being recruited by top-tier universities. He said, quote, "I wouldn't have a job. I'm in my golden years. I want to spend what little time I have on this earth with my wife, my kids, and watching my grandkids play ball. They got an opportunity to go to the league. I want to go to the game, sit in the stands, eat a hot dog, and cheer them on. I want to work with the younger one before he goes to college. I don't need a job. I worked all my life, some in the streets and some not. It's time for me to relax, and once I'm off parole, I'm quitting." Ray's statement highlights how this system looks at individuals leaving prison as a monolith. When we think about the intended focus of the Reentry Center, it was this assistance in what folks primarily needed. In many instances, this was navigating the legal realm, such as case management to understand parole and probation, employment and educational opportunities, and parenting and familial services. Mr. Dar, one of the senior case managers, was a master teacher in breaking down these services to newly arrived clients. Mr. Dar's most memorable saying was the analogy he used involving a gun. He would start by bringing a young man into his office and looking over his rap sheet and his, all those things, and he would comment, "Ooh, I see you like weapons. I'm going to give you one that isn't going to kill people but make you stronger. We're going to put some bullets in the chamber," he would say. "We're going to get you enrolled in school. That's one bullet. We're going to get you into one of our programs. That's another bullet. Then we're going to get you some job training skills. That's another bullet. And after that, we're going to get you a job, one more bullet. That way, next time you go in front of the judge or your PO, you're going to have all those chambers filled that they can't touch you. Oh, and we're going to get you an American flag pinned for your lapel." However, the reentry space also provided unintended usages. Jamie, a white woman in her early 30s, commented on the ability to use the bathroom in quote-unquote peace. For each bathroom in the facility, a key was needed to enter, and it was affixed to a large wooden block so that the key would not be stolen or lost. This security measure made these restrooms essentially one-person occupancy. Therefore, clients had a place to relieve themselves in private, something many could not do during their incarceration. Jamie said, "I'm embarrassed to talk about this, but the entire time I've been locked up, I've never sat on a toilet. The bathrooms in prison are disgusting. Even in our cells, it's not like they give us cleaning supplies, and you don't know who was in that cell before you. I probably got the strongest legs now because all I did was squat. And at the halfway house, it ain't much better. But here, I can get the key, shut the door, and sit down. It's an amazing feeling." And so I'll finish in terms of this part of the presentation with this concept of abolition. And while doing my field work, Trayvon Martin was killed by George Zimmerman, and I'm sure we've all either remember it or have heard about it. This death became a pivotal moment in a longer legacy of racial reckoning, sparked by a comment that stated, "How is prison going to help this situation?" Folks that I was working at the Reentry Center began to think and reconsider justice, specifically alternatives to incarceration and what abolition of a prison system would look like. Nobody was naive to the current world, and everyone recognized that there are heinous and violent crimes that occur. Yet, if we are to believe in a state and a system that keeps us safe, that system must reflect our values, not our emotions. In other words, does simply carrying out forms of vengeance move us towards greater public safety? Or rather do forms of investment in prioritizing care, harm reduction, and access to better qualities of life guide or should guide our justice system? Therefore, me, and the men and women who I met with multiple times a week for 3 years, we began to collectively come up with and discuss possible ways of challenging this system and coming to abolition through a variety of pathways, including this concept of taking it to trial, this notion of separation, not segregation, stopping for-profit justice, and making people whole through a restorative justice framework. This concept of restorative justice reminds me of the story of Darren, who was a black male in his mid-40s who served nearly 2 decades in prison. He and I were tabling at a summer music festival for the Reentry organization. While standing in front of the table talking, he cut me off mid-sentence, saying, "Excuse me, Smiley, I'll be right back." I watched Darren briskly weave through the crowd and approach a black man a few years his senior. Because of the music, I could not hear them, but I noticed a serious expression on Darren's face. A minute later, a reserved smile appeared and the two men embraced. That was an old friend, Darren explained. Later, though, he recanted his previous statement and admitted, "That guy I spoke to was someone from my past. He was someone who I had robbed." "Really?" I asked. "Yeah. When I was out there doing dirt, I robbed him and his brother. We were all from the same neighborhood, committing crimes and what have you. I probably haven't seen him in over 20 years, but I recently learned his brother passed away. I couldn't let him walk by without extending my condolences and asking for forgiveness. I told him I'm a changed man now and needed to look him in the eyes and apologize." I asked, "Did he accept your apology?" Darren replied, yeah, he did. And so I truly believe we can put reentry out of business. But this is not an overnight or quick change. And this is where abolitionism takes us further than reform ever can. While non-reformist reforms have its merits, especially as short-term fixes for immediate issues for those who are within carceral settings, the long-term vision must be that of abolition, which reimagines justice and reimagines a system of justice. This is the intersection of where I come to this idea of what I'm thinking through as abolition reentry. Borrowing from scholar and historian W.E.B. Du Bois's concept of abolition democracy, Professor Angela Davis articulates that abolition democracy is the dismantling of institutions of dominance, which would include prisons, but also systems of reentry. So as Du Bois argued, after the Civil War, the concept or the era of Reconstruction was cut short when a lot of what was fought and died over did not come to fruition, but the allowance of Jim Crow and other segregationist laws and institutions that were implemented that created a second-class citizenship. So the reality is that the only reason reentry is needed is because of what criminalized surveillance, police, jails, courts, and prisons do to a person. It strips them of identity, communication, love, and individuality. Prison exacerbates social stratification and disparities that this punishment system creates by removing people from community, placing them in environments of harm, and eliminating forms of social and cultural capital. The entire notion itself of reentry is about relearning, because the obvious point of the current system is about cruelty and punishment. If our system is invested in making better citizens, then our priorities need to shift, and that means actively working towards putting reentry out of business in all forms. And so finally, I'll end here. Abolition is about hope. Abolitionist Miriam Kaba says it best. Hope is a discipline. It is an action. It is not passive. We must actively engage in abolitionist praxis, understanding that things we do today are not going to be shown immediately. This work is hard. It can be draining, depressing, and cause all types of despair. Yet, hope is a discipline. It is active. And so let me share how recently, while working with system-impacted youth in New York City, we discussed abolition. And so to give you some context, these, when you watch the news and you hear things bad about New York City by the, local news, yes, these are those kids who are accused of those types of crimes. They are there as pretrial detainees, but I'm sitting there and we're talking about how to think about concepts of how do you reduce harm, engage in repair, and spread accountability. And so while sitting with them, we discussed abolition, and I asked them the following question. If you could replace this jail with anything else, what would it be? They pondered, and after the initial I don't knows, they provided tangible answers, which included a hospital, a shelter for families, a mall, and a luxury hotel. When I asked about each, I was provided with an astute response. A hospital, especially a place that, as they said, specializes in gunshot victims, as too many of them saw both their friends, their foes, and even themselves needing life-saving care. A shelter for families because of how many people they saw sleeping on the streets. A mall because there are no places in their community for folks to just come together and chill. And finally, a luxury hotel, because as one youth said, quote, why should only the rich people downtown have nice things? In all these cases, these young folks were responding to a question in the most pragmatic way, imagining the missing. Here they wanted things that others had. So let me leave you with this. Abolition does not need to be solely an academic exercise or a utopian dream, but rather the pragmatic, tangible, and attainable. We just have to fight for it. So I want to end there. Thank you for having me, and I'm so excited that you guys are here, and maybe if there's some questions, we have time for some questions.
Oh, thank you for that. That was fantastic. I'm going to, it's open for questions for about 25 minutes. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand and I'll bring you the microphone.
So what do you think is the biggest obstacle to abolishing reentry, like in America right now?
Yeah, I mean, there's several, right? I think one is that, unlike other things, right? Crime is emotional, right? That's why I said, like, when we think about, when you watch the 6 o'clock news, right? And you're like, oh my God, how could that happen? And so one of the biggest challenges is to get, if we're thinking about it in this kind of policy way, how do you convince elected officials that the data proves that investing in alternatives to incarceration, such as healthcare, education, housing, at baseline, reduces crime? Because most elected officials are elected for a finite amount of time. And as we know, implementation of policy often takes time to come to fruition. So the gamble is, I'm mayor for 4 years. You're asking me to invest into something that might not come into fruition for 10 years. So I'm gonna get all of the shit, all of the backlash, all of my adversaries who say he's soft on crime. He isn't doing the right thing. Look at that baby was killed, right? Because again, bad things happen. And so that's one of the biggest obstacles, right? How do we get people to really take into account that yes, we need these things, and it's going to take time for things to change, right? And so that's what I'd say is the biggest one. I could keep going, but that would be one of the biggest ones. There's no other questions. I guess I'll keep going.
I see one in the back.
Thank you for that question.
I was just wondering how you found the people of the stories that you were telling. Like, how did you find those people?
Oh, how did I get into it? Thank you. That's great. And maybe I should have incorporated that talking to an undergrad class. So I started this research in 2010. 2010 was an interesting year for me, both professionally and personally. Professionally, I was in my second year of a PhD program, but it was also the year, as I said in the talk, that was the first year that more people came out of prison that went into prison. It was also the year that Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, had been published. So, that book really took mass incarceration or this system out of kind of ivory towers and stuff and really made it kind of a household conversation for people. And so, I had really started to get into it from that perspective, right? Like, oh, this is something that's interesting, I should look into. But it was also the year that my father and I reconnected, right? So my parents got divorced when I was 2. Throughout my childhood, my teen years, my father had gone back and forth to prison. And then in 2010, he had reached out, like randomly. And we reconnected. And part of our reconnection, because we haven't spoken in about 10 years, was like unpacking, his incarceration, his reentry, and his, substance abuse that he had struggled with for, 40, like quite literally 40 years. And so it was through those conversations with him and getting to know him as an adult, right? It's kind of weird to like get to know your parent as an adult, like you're an adult, they're an adult, and like you're kind of meeting this person for the first time. And when I started telling him about things that I had been doing when I was living here in Pennsylvania, I had done anti-death penalty work here. And so I was really already kind of interested in the criminal justice system from that perspective. And so it was him who said, well, if you have all these kind of questions, let me introduce you to someone I grew up, someone who looked out for me, and that was Mr. Dar. And so my father said, I'm going to give him your number. And like quite literally the next day, I got a phone call from this very raspy voiced man saying, hello, whatever. And he says, why don't you come to the office tomorrow, 10 a.m. sharp? And I was like, all right. So I got on NJ Transit, left Harlem, went to Newark, and I get to this reentry center. And he goes, what do you want to know about reentry? And so like we had like a 2-hour conversation, and then he was like asking me what I knew about. And I had mentioned, the 13th Amendment and how, if you've neither slavery nor involuntary servitude was prohibited for the exception of criminal conviction and blah, 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 blah. We had a conversation. So then he gives me a tour of this reentry space. It's so crazy. And I'm thinking like, all right, he's walking me out. And he walks me into this conference room with like 4 guys sitting there. And he goes, why don't you go ahead and lead this program today? Literally. And he goes, because he was a tall guy, he put his arm around me and he said to the guys there, he goes, this is Smiley, he's gonna lead group today. This is my kin, this is my nephew, we blood. So you're gonna listen to him, right? And they was like, yes, sir, yes, they was doing all that. And then he turned, and as he walked out, he just said, talk to him about that 13th Amendment stuff. And so I kind of got thrown into this world of reentry that, I was kind of like, ooh, is this something interesting? And, I started keeping promises, right? Like they wanted me to come back. I kept going, and I ended up being there for like almost 3.5 years. So I know I was kind of long-winded, but you asked the question.
Far corner? Oh, wow. Okay. All right. Where are you?
Okay. What do you think, what do you say to people who don't think that like abolishing the prison system is practical, or how can you frame it in a way that makes it easier for them to understand and
Absolutely, right? So some of you might have heard me say, he wants to get rid of what? This man is crazy. I'm going to tune out for the rest of the time because he ain't talking about anything realistic. Well, I would respond to that in a couple ways. One, as I believe I try to express, is that it's not an overnight thing, right? No one who I think takes abolition serious thinks that today there's prisons, tomorrow there is not. In fact, I would argue against that even as an abolitionist because, we have to think about a lot of the other social issues and social problems in society that would need to be remedied before we actually even get rid of this. In fact, some of the youth I work with have expressed to me that they know that if they were free, if they were in the streets, they'd be dead. So jail is literally saving their life. And someone might turn around and say, see, jails are good. And I would turn around and I would challenge them and say, no, that shows how terrible jails are and terrible that the only social safety net that teenagers have in, the richest country in the world is to go to jail, right? The second part how I would answer that is that I would never frame asking someone about abolition in a binary. I would never ask someone, do you want prisons to go away? Because now you've situated that conversation in yes or no. I take, and from the teachings I did when I did death penalty work, I frame the question as open-ended. So for example, when I used to do anti-death penalty work in the state of Pennsylvania, and I was doing that 2008, 2009, when Pennsylvania had the fourth largest death row. At its zenith, it was like 228 people. If you ask the average Pennsylvanian, do you believe in the death penalty? The knee-jerk reaction is yes. Just yes. Even though Pennsylvania didn't use it. In fact, Pennsylvania, since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976, only executed 3 people, exonerated 6. So it wasn't in their interest to keep this system alive. It's expensive, it's, all these kind of things. So instead of going, when we were doing door-knocking campaigns or, signature campaigns, instead of asking people, do you believe in the death penalty, I asked them, what does public safety look like to you? And people would give me a whole litany of answers. They would say, more crossing guards during school hours, better playground equipment, better housing, better equipment even for the cops, anything. Like it was everything but more death penalty. So I'd let people ramble on 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes, and I'd say, you know what you didn't say? The death penalty. And that's where we can start a conversation. So I approach my abolition work in that same way. I would never ask somebody, do you believe in prisons? Because that also is a zero-sum game with no alternatives. We don't have an alternative to that system. So yes, when someone commits a criminal fraction, whether that's steal a bag of chips or murders an entire family, it's the same result, right? It's something within this criminal legal system. And we don't have that alternative yet. So that's how I would approach that, is that we have to have space to have a conversation, challenge each other, debate it. Because I would say, in closing on that question, is that abolition is the start, it's not the end.
Hi. I was just wondering what you think the purpose of the criminal justice system is, and if there are any sorts of, I guess, punishment you think is not justifiable.
All right, so I'll go with the second part and then go back to the first. So, the death penalty. I mean, I'm someone who doesn't believe in the death penalty. I don't think the state should be in the business of killing people. It's also a weird thing to do. The state kills people to tell people not to kill people. I mean, it just doesn't really make sense. I don't think that's needed. I don't believe in solitary confinement. Both the science as well as the social implications of it are detrimental to people, as international human rights organizations and scientists have shown that someone who is confined to solitary confinement for 14 days or more literally have physiological changes to their brain, right, that are irreversible. And so, we've had people who've done years in solitary confinement, right? So I would say those things are maybe top 2. To the first part of the question, I think where a lot of people who study this stuff get really frustrated is that we want to believe that a criminal justice system is here to protect us, public safety. But when you look at it, when you look at the data, when you look at the science, when you look at the history of it, it's not what happens. When we look at the history of policing, there's a great book by Alex Vitale that's called The End of Policing. And Alex traces the history of policing in the United States. In the South, policing as what we know today comes out of the history of slavery. Slave catchers were enforcing the law. If a slave ran away, guess who went out and got him? Massey didn't go out and get him. Colonel Sanders didn't go out and get him. Young men, right, who were deputized to go enforce the law. In the North, police were there to watch over and keep the immigrants in line, right? You got to remember, at one point, the Irish were not white. It's a weird thing to say in 2024, but Irish people were not considered white. They weren't black, but they weren't white. Italians, Jews, right? There was this kind of thing to watch them in this way, not to protect them, but to make sure that they weren't going to interfere with capital. And so when we think about the role of police, yes, sure, they help people sometimes, but more often we see them protecting capital. And I'll give a primary example of that. Whenever we see social movements happen, whether it was Black Lives Matter, Defund, Me Too, anytime, The police are out there in militarized gear. And what do they usually do? They usually surround CVS's to make sure that stores are not hurt. That's protecting capital. Doesn't matter that the police literally just killed a person and people are demanding justice. No, they're out there to protect capital. And so, it's not that I'm not an anarchist, right? Like I fundamentally believe in a state. And there would certainly, in any kind of vision of a democratic state, there would be some form of policing mechanism, someone who's going to enforce the rules. But what it looks like in its current iteration clearly is not working. In fact, since George Floyd was killed, more people each year consistently have been killed by the police. And that's with body-worn cameras, that's with diversity training, that's with hiring more minorities and women. So clearly there's a culture of violence that's perpetuated and exacerbated in policing. Last thing on that. The mayor of New York, Eric Adams, former cop, don't like the guy. Be transparent about that. He's a terrible person. But one thing he tried to do a couple months ago was he tried to implement a policy that police and corrections officers in New York City could not take steroids. Right? That seems simple enough, right? You don't want someone who's got roid rage watching over someone. The police and corrections unions went apeshit and said that is a violation of a person's, civil rights and stuff like that. You're a state agency. You have a job to do. Professional athletes can't even use steroids, but we're allowing people who are supposed to be protecting us to be using these substances that are oftentimes illegal? That's crazy. So, yeah. I see one or two maybe.
I'm just going to go straight across.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I just wanted to ask about knowing that prisons are very traumatic places and a lot of violence goes on. Do you have any insight into how the psychological impact of being in prison had on the incarcerated people, and how that made it more difficult to do reentry or to finish successfully not go back to prison?
Great question. So, and I'm glad you bring that up. So in chapter 3 of the book, which I call Body, I talk a lot about the kind of various ways that incarceration becomes inscribed on the body that stays with people. So there are certainly physical and mental happenings that occur. So in terms of, to your question, psychologically, yeah. I mean, a lot of people who've been incarcerated even talk about it, and some have even, like psychologists have labeled it as a form of post-traumatic stress disorder, right? The same thing that we would apply to someone who's been in a war, we would apply to people in prison because of that hyper-vigilance that you have to kind of carry with you because of the exacerbated form of violence that can occur at any particular moment. And so when you talk to people who've been formerly incarcerated, especially people who've done maybe some serious time, there are certain maybe things that they do that we wouldn't do. So one of the guys, I think it was Jamal, I don't think I put it in here, when he first came home, one of the tensions between he and his aunt was that he would take these extraordinarily long hot showers, right? To the point where it was like using up all the hot water, the bill was going up. And he explained to me, is like, when I was in prison, our showers were 2 minutes long and it was ice cold, right? And so for him, the psychology of just being able to have a hot shower was really important. Other guys talked about just staying in the bathroom because it's a smaller space, right? One guy in the book who I called, I think, Ricky, he talked about one day he was coming down to group, and whatever time our group started, and he came in sweating profusely, and he sat in the back and he calmed down. And afterwards, I was like, yo, what's going on? He was like, he got on the bus, and the bus didn't use coins anymore. He got locked up in the 90s, right? They had to do like a tap or like a swipe, and he didn't know what to do, and there were people behind him, no one was helping. And he was like, I felt my chest tightening. So I just got off the bus and I ran down here. Right? So there's all these ways in which people are constantly trying to get over it in the kind of psychological way. But then there's also the physical ways in which incarceration stays with people. And the one example I'll give here is what we call a $150, right? Which is a big scar goes across your face. If you get slashed with maybe a razor or a shank or something like that, well, like a knife of some sort. And especially if you're black, right, and your skin keloids, that can leave a very grisly scar. So imagine you're going into a job interview knowing that you have this thing that looked like Heath Ledger and the Joker across your face. That could cause both physical kind of reception that be negative, but also think about the psychology of how you see someone see you, right? And again, that's not something you can just little foundation going to get rid of that. And so these are different ways in which people are constantly trying to, again, navigate and negotiate that process. Just throw the mic.
Kind of as a follow-up to that question, I think I have a little bit of experience with this personally, and it's, reentry, as you mentioned, is not just the incarcerated individual, but it's the entire family. But furthermore, I think as a nation, we are looking at high rates of incarceration of individuals with mental illness who were never diagnosed, like many, in our white community have early diagnosis, we have access to doctors, therapists, medications, all kinds of programming from holistic to hospitalizations. But until you're really in it, you don't know how kind of deprived people are in our community. So my question is really in the United States, in Philadelphia, most communities in poverty, North Philadelphia, West Philadelphia, Southwest Philadelphia, have hundreds of families impacted by incarceration. And if you do have a person in prison, they call you and like this aunt or this grandmother, there's no training on how to prepare for reentry, right?
Yeah.
And there's also the issue of just like, how do we address that? Because we're not even asking about the trauma in that community. You're social workers or teachers or doctors, and you wonder why these kids can't read. Well, go up State Road someday and go and see children that are there in their uniform, waiting to go to a filthy, dirty bathroom that you wouldn't send your dog in. I mean, it's the trauma that, I think we're not talking about. So I congratulate you on bringing this conversation, and I guess what I would like you to address is just, like, what can we do about awareness, number one, that our communities, it's not just poverty, it's trauma, and it's trauma to the incarcerated and all of their families, their aunts, their mothers, their fathers, their brothers and sisters. You know that firsthand.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. No, thank you for that. I remember a couple years ago, the Philadelphia Inquirer did this kind of long-form article on quite literally generations of Philadelphia residents incarcerated. Like literally grandfather, son, and grandson, all in state prison, right? And so when we think about that kind of idea of generational incarceration that we've seen, and how do we get out of that, especially if they're given these super long sentences, right? And as real quick to that, before I get to the part about the trauma and stuff, Ruthie Gilmore, who's an academic, she wrote a book called The Golden Gulag, and she's written a lot about abolition and stuff. One of the things she argues is that prison, not only does it steal like your labor and things like that, it literally just steals your time. The vast majority of people who enter prison enter it during their prime working years, right? And then are there. And so by the time you get out, you should be in retirement age or whatever these, or you've lost those times to gain those skills. I remember one of the young men who I was working with, one day we were doing like resume building, and he had gone in for murder when he was 15 years old. And I remember we were talking, and I was like, well, just put down all your jobs that you've ever had. And he looked up at me, he was like, Smiley, I ain't never had no job. Because he had done 10 years from a juvenile to an adult. And I thought about that. We were the same age, but from 15 to 25, I graduated high school, got my BA, got my master's, was now in a PhD program, had multiple jobs, He survived a juvenile facility, and then when he turned 18, he went to state prison and was with all the men, right? So his whole 10 years was about survival. But to your question about the trauma, absolutely. And so how would I address that is that, first of all, I think that they're all interlinked. Poverty, health, education, because what happens is poverty compounds these things. As you mentioned, if you have a mental health issue, but you're coming from a middle class or affluent family, you have the resources to get a psychologist, to go to a psychiatrist and get, maybe medicines or what have you. You can go to a treatment facility. If you are poor, those sorts of opportunities aren't there. Right? We also have to think about like the opiate epidemic and other uses of heroin and other sedatives, right? Some of those times, those are pain medications, right? Like that's a way that you can remedy pain that you might be feeling, whether physical or mental, that circumvents the healthcare system that doesn't allow you to have that. And so how do we address those things? I mean, that's why I want to put reentry out of business. Everyone, there's this whole new thing. It's going across the country. There is money for days for trauma-informed prisons. They want to build trauma-informed prisons. Why don't we build trauma-informed housing, trauma-informed healthcare, trauma-informed schools? Why do we always feel the need to back-end the monies instead of front-end the monies and try to prevent the crimes and the infractions and harms before they even occur? Again, the data shows us education, healthcare, and stable housing eliminate a whole swath of crimes. Is there still going to be crime? Yeah, I don't think anybody's naive to that. But can we address it in another way? There's been various amounts of pilot studies, Florida, Utah, New York, where they've shown literally just give someone housing and give them a social worker, and you cut down the amount of times they cycle in and out of the jail per year, saving taxpayers money. But again, it goes back to the politician. Because what happens if you have a pilot study of 100 people, and 99 of them are doing the right thing, they're going to work, they're meeting with their social worker, they're staying in their housing, but that one person goes out and robs a bodega. That's the news. That's the headline. And that whole program gets shut down. And it's interesting. They're pilot programs. They're short-term grants. So we give all these kind of progressive or alternatives these very short timelines to try to, germinate and blossom. But cops literally, again, going back on cops here, on average, cops in America kill 3 people a day. But no one's saying, you know what, maybe we should give an alternative a try. No, it's just like, keep the wheel churning. And so that's how I would answer it. But again, I think it goes back to the first question is, we have to get people in office who are willing to take that risk that maybe their immediate legacy will be seen as crap or that they're not good or that they're, God forbid, soft on crime. But knowing that the longer legacy or the longer visions of what they implement will serve, the collective in a much better way.
So we have time for just one more question before we go. For those of you, before I solicit this last question, I do want to say if you are someone looking for extra credit, then the sign-up sheets will be available. For my classes, they'll be over there, and the same for the other profs. I don't know how y'all are doing it. Anyway, so that's a heads up. So time for one last question.
Seems like right over here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, let's end on a
Positive note.
Besides the research part and you sharing your personal story, how was this a healing journey for you?
How was
this a healing journey for you?
Oh,
this
a healing
process.
Journey. Yeah, my father's still in my life. The first time he and my mom had seen each other in also over a decade was when I got my PhD. We spent holidays together now, right? Like, we're all figuring out what's like, I think I'm hosting Thanksgiving, right? But we got to coordinate who's picking him up and all that kind of stuff. So I think that was definitely something I needed when I was in my early 20s, right? And I think the work I continue to do is part of what gives me joy, right? So a lot of the young folks I work with, the ones who, end up not going upstate for whatever reason, right? Maybe they didn't have to or whatever. We do reentry with them, right? I'm a big believer in Fred Hampton's quote of theory without praxis is bullshit. So, I'm going to practice what I preach. If I'm sitting here saying that we need services for folks and we need to be engaged with them, that's what I'm going to do. And so I think about about a month ago, I took 2 of my mentees to a concert, right? It was a concert in the city. If folks know who Sleepy Hollow and Chef G are, I took them to, a rap concert. And as we waited in line, one of the young men was like, have you ever been to a concert before to me? And I was like, yeah, of course. Like, that's a silly question. And I was like, you? And he's like, no. And so he asked a couple more questions. He's like, well, where are we going to sit? And I was like, no, it's general admission. We stand. Well, where's the performer? I said, up on stage. The young boy, he had no, lived experience of what that space looked like. So for us to be in that space and share that space and to, buy him a Coca-Cola at the concert, I spent $40 on 3 Coca-Colas. Don't go to a concert in New York City. It was atrociously expensive. But that gives me joy. That's part of, because again, like I said, this is hard. I think as I expressed to y'all when we met before, a couple of weeks ago, one of the young boys who I worked with a lot got murdered. He got out of prison at the end of August. He was killed early October, right? And so there's that. There's young folks who are going to go upstate and I'll never see them again. And then I also have to kind of prepare myself that, like everything, there's a bell curve. There's young folks who are in there because they just got caught up in something stupid and they'll go on and live very productive lives and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot in the middle who, unfortunately, because maybe circumstance or what have you, might cycle in and out of the system. And then there's kids, and I hate to say it, on the back end, you can already see the egg cracking. I hate to use that phrase, but you can already see that mental health is a real thing. And I'm preparing myself that there's probably going to be a day where I'm on the subway and I might see someone shuffle into the subway cart, no shoes on, no shirt, middle of the winter, mumbling. I'll be like, damn, I know him, or I knew him at one point because of that lack of a social safety net. So again, to leave on a more positive note, again, as Miriam Kaba says, hope is a discipline, and it's something that I think that I try to internalize, and I hope everyone else can too. So,
thank you so much.
Thank you. This is great. Good questions, everybody.